Hey everyone, welcome to week 8 for the group theory seminar on self-psychology group therapy. This one is exciting for me because it's a new one that I hadn't researched previously. Again, as an overview, this seminar will attempt to cover a couple different things, highlight some brief inception history of the theory, some of the core concepts, and discuss some differences between this approach and other interpersonal or psychoanalytic group therapy styles, as well as highlighting hopefully some interventions, some traits that can be embodied by the group leader and the core change factors in the theory. I'll also be trying to take it from a more social justice anti-racist frame to try and infuse that throughout the content for it. The book that I was recommended and highly recommend others check out if that's something you're interested in was by Peter Lessem, Self-Psychology and Introduction, as well as the two articles for the 75th anniversary, or one of the articles for the 75th anniversary group therapy journal that uses self-psychology by Walter Stone to answer the vignette that's posed, which again I recommend, and we'll put in the citations, references in the video description, as well as another article that was recommended to me about ruptures and repairs, which gives a really nice overview of self-psychology. This theory actually, I feel like, holds a lot of promise in terms of the attitudes and stance that we can take to assist in some of these difficult dialogues and ruptures within interpersonal conflicts with folks. So feel very excited about it. The concepts that I feel are missing from most theories are this idea of the sociocultural transference and context, in that we tend to come from this white Eurocentric origin. Most of the theories, articles, texts are colorblind, and they don't use any identity like variables or very many identity factors like race, ethnicity, neurodivergence, etc., as far as how to describe clients or how to describe the therapists. And so we don't get the interplay, the intersubjectivity, one might say, to the dance that each person is doing and how they may be interplaying off of one another in these dynamics. And I think self-psychology would really support this view. It's really important to highlight the subjectivity frame that we all come from, because there isn't an objective truth. And I think a lot of the texts and articles and interventions, the way that people talk about theories, it's seen as very objective. You do this when this happens. So this feels like my calling. This feels right, this theory, in a lot of ways. So I'm really excited to speak to it in more detail. So too long, didn't watch overview. I'm putting this out a little later in the week, but I wanted to do this very briefly. Self-psychology, it's developmental, which means that essentially you developed in the best way that you know how to get through your environment. If you want to think of that adage of survived 100% of your worst days. So obviously, like, you've adapted in some meaningful ways. And that's important. That needs to be honored. That needs to be treasured. I use the marionette metaphor for myself in terms of, like, we creatively adapt to the strings that get attached to us by the different systems, be that family, sociocultural, other influences in our lives. And then now it's our job to kind of be aware of those strings, be mindful and conscious of them, and honor them, like not necessarily say, oh, I need to change them, or I shouldn't be this way and I need to cut it. So that's kind of parallels in self-psychology in terms of how they would view resistance or adaptations. It's relational in terms of its frame. Empathy towards the subjective reality of the client is necessary to validate and affirm. And my gosh, if we did this, there'd be so much less work on our hands in terms of these inter-group dialogues on race and oppression and discrimination, because we'd really be staying with the person's subjective truth and not having to throw statistics or throw theory at it or kind of push people and dismiss them in different ways, which feels like it happens a lot interprofessionally as well as within our group therapy context. It also emphasizes human interdependence and its complexities, which I love, because again, it gets away and breaks from this individualistic mindset that we're not this bootstrap culture where we live in a vacuum and everything that we do is we're the reasons why we succeed, and when we fail, it's always all on us. They take it, and similar to the object relations view, that like we are our others, like, and so the people that influence us, those are the strings that tie to us and, you know, pull us to adapt in certain ways and to act in certain ways in life. And, you know, we're interdependent on one another. And so if I'm interacting with someone, how I show up as a white male, cisgender male who's somebody with ADHD is going to impact and going to influence and shift the dynamic with their own identity factors, right? We're going to play off of each other. We're going to shift and bring out different parts of ourselves with one another. And I think that's really meaningful to highlight the interdependence and the connectivity, as well as the ways in which we need each other for mirroring, support. There's a big value on, we don't grow up and just stop needing to be affirmed. And there's a lot of talk, I think, of selfishness, that people have a hard time being selfish, myself included. So it's really affirming to be able to read some of the needs, which I'll list in more detail later in the slides, that self-psychology espouses as our like basic psychological and emotional drives that we need to feel sustained, to feel cared for. He uses the analogy that, like, you know, much like we need oxygen, you know, to breathe. I think I may have mentioned that later in the slides. That's kind of how we are with our emotional nutrients and our psychological affirmations from others. So can't do that all for ourselves, no matter how much we adapt and try. It's not how it works. Its near exclusive focus in theory and practice is on personal subjectivity, that there is no objective truth, there is no neutral observer. And so I love it because it kind of pushes back on this idea of silence is not silent. You know, it has an effect, has an impact. And when you do nothing as a therapist, and when you take this analytical stoic stance, you know, as a person in power, as somebody who, like, if you see a microaggression happen and you don't act on it, then there is a message that you send in that, right? That there is something that we're stating by not mentioning race or microaggressions or power dynamics that will be present in group. Then we set the stage for us not to speak to them, not to address them. And so trying to say, like, oh, I don't want to influence the group a certain way, or what if people don't want to come here and talk about race or other like identities, if that's not what they signed up for. They signed up for to help with their depression. Like that all, again, doesn't excuse you from taking that neutral or non-stance in a way. So really think that's lovely. And then it's an optimistic outlook on human nature and possibilities for psychotherapy and for humanity. It kind of speaks again from that adaptive stance of, you know, a tree to a certain extent can grow around obstacles to unfurl its leaves to be able to get nutrients from the sun. And we have all adapted and twisted around a lot of really, really difficult objects in our lives. So being able to honor that and to recognize that we've still managed to adapt and get some nutrients, even if it's, you know, hurtful, even if it feels saddening and shaming and self-deprecating, that there was a purposefulness to that. And again, if we transplant that tree into different systems, it can be easier to get that sunlight without having to stretch and bend ourselves around it. So our sense of self is determined by the responsiveness of others. We appreciate the environmental failures that have happened to us and provide a new substitute for growth within the system of group therapy. Again, like in that Buddhist psychology frame of, we don't blame a flower for not thriving in a drought mentality. Don't yell at the cabbage for not growing. Cultivate the land around it. People can't live in a psychological vacuum. Like I mentioned before, shame is a very highly crucial affect that can really highlight a lack or a sense of disavowed needs coming from within a person, and should be reviewed with the goal of self-acceptance that you know, was missed or dropped in that. Rupture and repair is highlighted in the article that I listed, but it's a big component in terms of really needing to honor the rupture and repair process to make this a reparative experience. And I can speak to that really and how meaningful that can be for folks. And then tragedy befalls people, like, but it comes from without, you know, what is lacking in our environment and the systems that we grew up in, rather than within, as a personal failure. Try and speak to clients as your emotions are adaptive and necessary, and rather than taking your emotions as an objective judgment of your character. I feel disappointment, hence I'm a disappointment. This is about recognizing that you feel disappointed, then who is telling you that, right? Like, where's that coming from, and how can you reflect on that narrative pull on you? What does it speak to? What's disappointment driving to you and your value? Like, if I feel disappointed and sad that I've upset somebody and I ruptured a friendship, again, that could be a sign of your love and care for that person, right? You wouldn't feel that sadness or grief if you didn't love or care or want that person to be in a better space. And so again, I think it helps break that binary of our emotional experiences a bit more with this theory. So what's self-psychology compared to psychoanalysis? Well, again, like, it really shifted things from an internal pathological focus of psychoanalysis with the drive theory to the lack of the environmental self needs that were provided early in life, which caused the child to adapt and compensate for these lacking needs. Strengthening of the self through corrective emotional experiences that alters one's past adaptive self-organization is like the primary goal. That's like what we're looking to do in this. Rather than focusing on unconscious processes, making them conscious. It's a little contradictory because in essence, I think you are kind of still doing that. Because we're wanting to make meaning, I think, of what felt or seems meaningless in a lot of ways. Again, saying like the garbage of our past moments and saying like, I lost all these relationships because I was too scared to talk to women or to try and put myself out there, but recognizing like that was protective because of my like feared rejection earlier in life and being seen in a negative light from like certain caretakers. That's something that felt like I don't want to re-experience that. I don't want to have these emotions. And so this was a way for me to get my needs met, even if it was only like partially so in different ways. So being able to recognize that. Structuralization, I think is like the word that I meant to write there, is something that's mentioned in the text, and it highlights these kinds of 3 principles that I think are really important in terms of we're wanting to have ongoing regulation, like of someone's experience within the session. We're wanting to notice like just their ongoing process, how they hold themselves, what's the way that they adapt or move within the session. If they're more quiet, if they're more boisterous and interrupt a lot, or whatever that adaptation is, then notice any disruptions that we have as a leader or another member within the group, if there's a disruption, and repair those ongoing regulations, heightening the affective moments of the session, recognizing that that's what really helps us internalize structure in our person's mind. So they would say like the way in which we grow is by having a certain routine, and then when we have a shift in that routine or a break in what we see as like, oh, this is my solid secure base that I know I'm going to come here every week at group therapy, I'm going to be understood. I've had like a client be really excited to tell me about getting back into the dating scene, and was very excited to tell the whole group about it and carried a lot of positive energy. And because of that, I felt some frustration at the group members not getting shared time. And so when I like commented on that and put it about them instead of focusing on the system of what the group was doing or how the group was kind of allowing that to be the dynamic in some ways, that brought the female member, a lot of shame and a lot of feelings of that rupture and saying like, well, I shouldn't have said anything, or, I've like tried to share this like exciting, meaningful moment. And it was a very like, a very real, like, I don't know, I want to say like childlike moment in its excitement and innocence, which I think is what self-psychology really gets at. And it wasn't given the response that they were hoping for from me, which was that affirming like validation and kind of encouragement throughout that process. And so, but by doing that, I had to acknowledge it, I have to repair it. And now, months later, not that this is again my goal, like I have to have this happen, because I think this is one of those pieces that we need to be respectful of where people are in that process, and that's not, when we do a microaggression, in this case, something that was maybe misogynistic and playing into those like sexist overtones of blaming the woman instead of the system that like pushes her to be a certain way or to not be a certain way, then that's not their job to get us to that repair, to give us that like feedback. Our goal is to hopefully have the meaning and really affirm their experience. And so for weeks of that, I remember saying and just commenting on like noticing the distance, noticing the silence from that member, and wanting to encourage her and like naming that experience. Like, no, this person, they're still frustrated at me, and that makes sense. You know, I really betrayed them and let them down, or their trust. And that's something that, you know, I don't take for granted as we're like continuing in this today. So I'm grateful for the group like checking in on her, and like grateful for her setting that boundary for herself. So wanting to really respect that and put it in the context of that person's life, and why in other like relationships that pattern has been kind of recapitulated by me and her in that moment, so that we can help change the reparative structure of that. Instead of just being dismissed, instead of being scapegoated or being seen as resistant for something that happened weeks or months ago, we're affirming that, we're accepting, we're empathizing with how hard that experience is. And I think that's really the key in a lot of ways, is self-psychology is really focusing on honoring the depth of the suffering that folks have, instead of taking it as some secretive, manipulative way that they're resisting treatment in that. So they also reworked the idea of narcissism in a really meaningful way. Narcissism was originally conceived as something to outgrow. Like Freud had a view that you can't be like loving yourself and give somebody else love, like that those two things can't happen simultaneously. And the view has actually kind of been shifted more towards like actually like most of the time when you're feeling loved by somebody, you feel really good about yourself. And I mean, this actually happened fairly recently in a couple of different groups of mine, but you know, you see somebody coming in and they've got that smile on their face, and group members are like, oh, what happened? What's going on? You were really upset last week. And they go on a date, they start a new relationship, and there's an excitement there because they're getting fed this love and this interest and desire from the system that they're like they're a lovable person, and that makes them feel that lovability, that makes them believe and have that voice kind of heightened in their mind that this is okay, or maybe it lessens the critical, negative, self-deprecating voice that's always like reinforced by the absence of that love and care. So again, I think that, you know, kind of speaks to how it's good to have some amount of narcissism, some amount of like, you know what, I am worthwhile, and I am like able to have value in this world. That can foster that sense of maturity, humor, creativity, and wisdom that each of us has within us in different ways. And it's not that you can't have pathological narcissism. And in fact, I think there's probably very clear examples in people's minds when we think about that. But, you know, the pathological type would be more the difficulty of overcompensating one's, the fragility of one's confidence, right? Like we only like act like we're perfect and we're the best ever at something when we fear of being like hurt or shattered, right? Like there's a reason in which like that can be again seen as protective and adaptive as well, you know. And so I would kind of say it's not that I like that or necessarily am happy about how that drives people and their ambitions to focus on their needs or make it all about them. But again, trying to understand and empathize with that is the key to this process. So yeah, healthy, again, narcissism doesn't mean you're not going to have any doubt, but you know, when you get the blows of life and you fall down, you get back up again, and you take that as, you know, something in your environment, you know, that prevented you from being as successful, right? If you had bad weather while you were driving and you didn't drive quite as well, or get to work quite as fast, you don't blame yourself for not driving in the rain better. You just understand that there was rain that day. Things in your environment and system changed. Freud's idea was, again, yeah, like I mentioned, there's less energy that we have to care for others. But Kohut really embody this importance of parental figures and how they, again, I would say when we talk about parental figures or caretakers, think about the third parent of the sociocultural messages that we get, because that feels quintessential to something that gets consistently imbued in us overtly and covertly throughout our lives. But that can really affirm the inner child's grandiosity, exhibitionism, and omnipotence. And I see this with my 3-year-old daughter, Sonia. Like, she's so excited that she can solve this like train puzzle where she's counting to like 20. And she loves doing it like every day with me, and loves the excitement, loves the cheering, loves the like counting of the numbers. And so being able to affirm that like grandiosity and like, you know, saying like, you're the best, you're great. Like that is something that's really needed, to have that internalized sense of like, you know what, I am worthy, and like I'm getting this from my figures. Because if I ignored her or didn't, you know, give her attention, or, you know, chastise her for interrupting me as I record for the 3rd time, then like that would, you know, send a different message, right? That would tie something else to, it's not okay for me to ask for this attention, or it's a bad thing for me to want this love or affection from others. And those things stay. Those are the templates in which we like presuppose all our other subjective reality on, and trying to help people understand that that's their subjective lens, and that you know, they couldn't change that. That's okay. Like that's what they needed to do to get by and to get their needs met, while still, you know, providing hope that now that you're in different environments, now that you know that that's going to be your autocorrect, like then with that mindfulness and like choice, you can be more flexible to notice where you're being pulled and not go with that sway. So yeah, really goes against this individualism view though of the ego psychology. Again, it's focusing more on when you maturely have narcissism, it's more of the acceptance of your dependence and interdependence on the environment to affirm, support, and define you. Again, I think that makes sense. Like so many times when I've talked to clients individually about the concept of focusing on the system's effect on them, as opposed to the individualist like view of I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm not motivated enough. It's like their eyes light up and they will end the session saying like, I've never thought of that before. Like this is really revelatory, and you know, this thing feels like very meaningful for us to work towards this work in our group, individual, and I think in ourselves, importantly. So shame, like I mentioned before, tied to narcissism and self-psychology, a very painful emotion about the whole self, and really derails the narcissistic experience. So like when I gave that example of Sonia, which I've mentioned in another talk, but essentially when I chastised her for throwing plastic bags on the ground, not realizing that there was a plastic bag holder installed in our new house under the light that she was trying to turn off. The amount of like the immediate like look at me in despair and sadness and shame as she collapsed to the floor, as a 2.5-year-old does, and just cried and wailed out, was that big feeling of like, you know what, I was trying to reach this thing and do my best, and this system changed, and it was really hard for me to reach that light. And my dad didn't see that. I didn't do it right. I'm the problem. Like, you know, and just like internalizing that is just so heavy to see. And, you know, like she forgave me for that, like I probably mentioned before. But I did apologize, and, you know, for my hastiness and losing her innocence, and that she's really doing her best in the systems that she's navigating to. So that misattunement that we all have, or the non-responsiveness, which is even worse than misattunement, the rejection or the numbness, can be akin to death. Again, like there's research on child development where if you're not given the warmth, touch, and care of another human, then your like spine will shrivel up and die. I think that's in the Body Keeps the Score by Vesser Vanderkolk. So just recognizing that really, like, it's not just a quote when we say we need that human responsiveness and connection to live that is biologically imbued in us. And so, yeah, needing that affirmations, needing the mirroring of your experiences and the acceptance by an idealized other. And that doesn't change. Again, that doesn't go away. We're adults. It's just When we're children and we're in neglectful environments, then again, we imbue that idea that it's a shame, something's wrong with me for even wanting the attention, for even considering that I deserve love being felt, or having love felt by me is wrong in some ways. So when we are in that environment, we construct this concept of our ideal self through our caregiver's attunements, misattunements, and that becomes the internal marker of our shame. In a lot of ways, the self-psychology view kind of goes hand in hand with the omnipotent child that I spoke about at week 5 for object relations theory, which I highly recommend for people that are interested in this and feel like it's, because it talks about really addressing shame and enhancing grandiosity in group therapy, which I don't think is really, it's not something that I've thought about before. Like, how do I boost up the grandiosity of my clients to really, like, yeah, give them props, make them fucking, they're legendary, you know, they're great at what they're doing. One of my group members has been called the emotional sniper, in that he just knows how other people are feeling. And so really boosting that up, like spot on with his emotional interpretations of other members. And, you know, Ormond talks about those specialty versions where somebody may have a cue into body language, or maybe really good at bringing out aggression or sexuality or other kinds of more derided feelings in the group. So really just enhancing people's self-efficacy in that, I think, is really meaningful. And again, we fantasize and imagine the impact we have on others in our environment mirrors the responses and misattunements we received earlier in our emotional environment. So this is the idea. And I've been trying to explain this in a way that's really concise and easy to understand for people. Not sure if I'm there yet, so you can tell me. But the idea is that, again, since we are so subjective, like if I imagine that if I'm asking somebody, I'll just speak from my experience, my subjectivity, if I ask for somebody to help me write a note for a group, then there's an immediate sense of like, oh, I'm worried that this person will see me as selfish, because like if I get seen as selfish from people, then I'll be rejected. And I imagine like that again. It's kind of this idea that because that's the way that I view the world, that people will think about this my way, then I'll automatically like put my presumptions that people will think just like I do on this. That if nobody else ever offers it to me, I might feel some like secret like anger and frustration of like, person's so selfish. I don't really necessarily feel that currently, but trying to go with this example, the idea is that we always assume that people see the world through our own eyes. So when we're doing this, we're trying to help people understand that people have their own systems and views and experiences that it makes it it's impossible to predict, and kind of silly in some ways to assume that they will view us from the exact lens that we view ourselves, because we view ourselves through the lens of our parental other figures, right? So again, the self is not a concrete being. The self is made up of all the strings from those past experiences. And so we assume those are the same strings everybody has. Even though we know cognitively that that's not the case. Obviously, yes, you're this identity, you're this background, you're different from me, you're different gender, etc. But emotionally, that is a felt truth and a fear, I think, of being seen in the way that we like see others. Like I don't want somebody to feel ashamed and or like they're burdened with other things, and so I want to not have that done to me. So I'll act in such a way to avoid that from happening. One of my other clients used the example that he's afraid that his partner will look at him and think of him as the same way that his mother would treat him, that he's a pain, he's a burden, and like he shouldn't, he's not worth being with, and will abandon him. And again, like because of these small things that he may do that appear frustrating or annoying, and his partner's never given him that like feedback or anything, and so part of that is being able to affirm like, well, if they're not saying that, then that is their responsibility and their subjectivity. We can't know, we have to ask. We like similar in as a therapist too, right? We may have a lot of knowledge from these theories and backgrounds, but the interpretations that we do, they're a fantasy, they're an imagination. Like it's just so narcissistic for us to think that we have it all figured out. And that's, I think, what it's difficult, because when you're writing that in texts and you're writing books and articles, it's written with such degree of like a certainty that this is what happened, this is how things are. And it almost makes me think, if I'm basing my analysis on self-psychology, like for the articles that I'm reading, then the only interpretations that should be written in there are the ones that the clients have affirmed for the authors or the writers, because otherwise we're not really certain about it, because their felt truth is the one that matters to us, not the one that we interpret post hoc, looking back, and we say with all of our intellectualism that that is what happened, that is because of their mother that this happened. So it was a long-winded thing, but I felt like I wanted to try and get at some of those points, and hopefully one of those examples stuck. I'll be more concise in some of these other examples, but again, individualism to interdependence. This is more of a stance in a lot of ways. Well, I think this in intersubjectivity than its own like theory, but when we talk about that from Kohut's view, he again uses this really nice quote of, there's a move from dependence, symbiosis, to independence, autonomy in the psychological sphere. And doing that kind of move from symbiosis to autonomy on my own is no more possible, let alone desirable, than a corresponding move from a life dependent on oxygen to a life independent of it. And so like you literally can't live without the dependence of others. It's kind of like the takeaway from that, similar to like how we can't live without oxygen because we need to breathe. So yeah, the self-psychological needs, they don't go away or dissipate. And again, there's some images or experiences like transitional objects, like in object relations theory talks about it as well, that can help us be affirmed with that inner security. Like, oh, I have this blanket's like God given from my mother, and so there's some comfort in that. Honey bear, what have you, and that can also take the place again of peer groups, friends, partners, media, culture. All kinds of self-object needs can be met by these things. Things that affirm, resonate with our authentic, accepted experience. And if you have a really sad song that just gets to your gut, then you can be like, yes, I feel understood, I feel comprehended by this movie and media. So again, part of us is we're trying to resonate with those emotional experiences and to recognize when there's this disconnection and rupture so we can repair it. They say you should use self-object as an adjective, like as opposed to a noun. So when we talk about self-object needs, it's basically human needs, if I'm trying to like, simplify this language. But it gets confusing. A lot of these things with object relations sound confusing. So I would just say, if you replace self-object with human, you pretty much get the meaning of it most of the time. So self-psychology is a misnomer, since the psychology of the selves are related to one another and represented inside of us. So again, it's ourselves, like as opposed to just a singular self in that way. So this is a cool list that I feel is helpful to mention, but these are the different self-object needs. The first three are from Kohut, and the others have been expanded from other articles and theorists. The mirroring need, a need to feel, and again, this is both childhood and adulthood. We don't grow out of this. We have a need to feel recognized, accepted, affirmed, and valued, especially when we're showing something important to someone valuable that we care for. So like when I talk about something exciting that happened at work to my significant other, and if they don't feel excited about an accomplishment, it's a big blow to my sense of self-worth. Like I shouldn't brag about this, and it's tough. Like there's a desire to get affirmed by I care about people. And so I want to share these like videos with people professionally and personally that I know, and I also don't want to come across selfish. And so there's this push-pull of like, am I allowed to do this, knowing that the reason I'm doing this is it really fills a need of mine to be mirrored, to get that affirmation, acceptance, that pat on the back, great job email that people send. and recognizing, yeah, that is okay. That's actually something we all need, and trying to really normalize that process, I think, is so lovely. Idealizing need and need to experience oneself as being part of and protected by an admired and respected other, needing the opportunity to be accepted by and merge into a stable, calm, powerful, wise, protective other who's experienced as possessing the qualities that, like, the subject lacks. So, for me, I think having mentors in group therapy, or again, as clients looking to ourselves as leaders, like, we can be that idealized, like, other that they can really admire and want to be protected by and cared for as a stable, calm, secure presence. I know for me, it's been really meaningful at my previous job, and even here, like, being able to talk to certain folks and feeling like, you know what, I feel cared for and secured. And again, like, idealizing needs, I think, can transcend power differentials. Like, I don't think you have to be above somebody. Somebody can be a peer or even in a subjugated or subordinate position, and I can still, if I can, like, recognize that power is subjective and superficial in some ways, still really respect the care and love that I get from other folks like that in the trainee roles. So alter ego or twinship is a nice way of thinking, like, I just want to be able to see myself in others. And when I I do this in group all the time, like, right, when you're asking someone, what part of yourself do you recognize in another person in the group? Or like when someone says, like, oh, I really connect with that, I'm like, oh, what part of you is the same? So you can kind of start to see the strands that connect one another in group. Because you want to feel like there's an essential likeness. Like, yeah, my life, my emotions are valid. And when I bridge someone and say, like, why do you think he feels like he's not worth anyone's time? And they say it's probably because he's been told that by parents who didn't give a shit about him, like, and they, like, nail that on the head, like, for them, then that's super affirming for clients to experience that twinship or that alter ego where they have that connectedness with one another. Just goes to show why bridging can be such a powerful tool. Efficacy need to experience that one has impacted an important other, or has an impact on the important other, and is able to evoke needed self-object experiences. So me being able to feel the self-object needs of others, the human needs of others, is also really important. Again, I'm trying to separate this into simpler language. It's important for me to feel needed as well. An adversarial need, a need to experience an attachment figure as benignly opposing force who continues to be supportive and responsive while also encouraging active opposition, confirming at least partial autonomy, and the need for availability of self-object experiences of assertive adversarial confrontation. This is all a long way to say it's really great to have somebody who you can contest with, push back on, and even feel frustration or, like, assert a boundary with and your needs, while having them really accept that and be, like, proud of you for that, and not, scapegoating you, shaming you. I think so many times in dialogues when there's a microaggression, or even when I just ask clients on a very simple level to say, like, who do you feel least connected to in the room right now, which is a really malicious question in some ways, but by working on binaries, I think I'm less interested in the answer and more interested in the experience that can provide people. Even when I say, like, who do you feel most connected to, people can say, like, oh, I don't want to say that because I'm afraid of leaving people out, and that doesn't seem fair, and I would hate to be left out, and I'm not going to do that. Like, and I can push and pull and do my little therapist encouragements, invitations, but if they, like, hold a stance to that, or if it feels very like, important for them to, like, set that boundary, then I'm gonna respect that. I'm gonna praise that. And the other group members can get angry at me for calling favorites and not treating other people that way. But again, I think that's important too, right? You can affirm their anger at you. Bion and Tavistock often talks about how sometimes, almost like in the war mentality, that people need an adversary, and the group can sometimes, like, formulate against the leaders. But it doesn't have to be a coup, so to speak, where it has to be destructive. Like, people can, even playfully say, like, you know what, I'm not listening to Vinny. I'm not going to answer any of his feelings questions. I'm just going to say this to you. Like, and that's I think, you know, a good thing to not shut down necessarily, right? That there's something that's meaningful about that, like sticking it to the man in this case. And, you know, having that be respected and cared for and like honored, you know, that they were able to do that, praised again for that grandiosity in that moment. Self-delineating need is the need for assistance with the articulation of perceptual and affective experience. My view is that's like you being able to articulate what your like emotions and perceptions of the world are, and kind of doing that intersubjective dance between the both of you to get at that middle ground. I say like we're on our own islands of experience, and I'm wanting to like ride through the emotional undercurrents to try and connect with you somewhere in the middle. But that's a very fluid and dynamic environment. And so I may not like quite meet you there, and you know, we may have to adjust our sales and everything. The metaphor could use work, but you know, like that's the concept that I really like to reflect on in terms of we want to work with people to really speak to their subjective truth. And validation need. We need to be validated for our subjective reality. When people say that they've gone through racism and they felt something you did was a racist attack, sexist, misogynistic, you know, again, just own up to it and name that that's like, you know, something that you're really wanting to honor with them. It really doesn't matter what you intended, right? This is more about the impact that it had on them, and there's something that you can grow on in that. Once we get through this idea that we have to be perfectionistic, or that we need this, you know, again, it's a sense of secure self that it is okay for me to be, to make mistakes. It's okay for people to be angry or sad with me. In fact, if somebody's angry at me, that's a very intimate act, right? They're showing me a sense of, they're holding me up a wound of theirs and saying, please honor this, don't hurt it, don't dismiss it and throw it away. So hold that tenderly. And, you know, that validation can make a world of difference. I can't tell you how many different clients, and it's not a point of pride, but like there's many clients where I've done microaggressions and other things that have been pointed out to me that have been very meaningful ruptures and repairs, because I've really been able to lean into that validation of their experience and just being there from that growth mindset, that beginner's mind, rather than feeling like I have to protect my ego or degrees or certified group psychotherapy, etc. So guidelines for analyzing ruptures and disruptions. I think this is a nice, helpful guide. You want to, again, notice the actions or qualities of the therapist that produce the disruption. Its specific meaning to the patient's subjective like reality and experience, its impact on the therapeutic bond and the patient's self-experience, the early developmental trauma, and I'd say like, again, racial trauma in most cases, that it revives, recapitulates, replicates for the patient, and their fears and expectations of how the therapist will react to them, and their painful feelings that will follow in its wake. You know, again, I think it's important to, like the thing that comes to my mind is when, again, I've made these references before in a different video, but I feel like it bears repeating because it feels very poignant in my figural foreground at this point. A client who was speaking about her father and making a comment, a Black woman who was speaking to her father and saying, you know, he would never express anger like this other white male member did, because he would always ask himself, you know, is this worth going to jail for? And if it wasn't, then he wasn't going to do anything to put himself in that situation. And I, repeating that to the group, said, how do people feel about, you know, this member highlighting that what her father said about if this isn't worth going back to jail for, then I'm not going to do it. And her being like, back to jail? Why would you say that? I didn't say back to jail. Like, that's not what I said. You know, being able to name that, like, oh yeah, you know, that was, you're right. Like, that was me. That was my own like white supremacy part of me being told, and I'm sad about that. I'm noticing, like, you know, the impact that it had, that this is, again, like kind of one of this recapitulated experiences where we assume criminality with Black, and that's really frustrating. I imagine that this is a message that's happened before, like for you. and afterwards, again, as we go into this dialogue further back and forth, I'll be saying like, I noticed that you were kind of laughing and smiling, and I imagined like myself that there would be a lot of frustration and pain that like somebody who's supposed to have this shit together and not just create a microaggression so blatantly like would do something like that. But I didn't get that, so I guess I imagine there was a reason for it. So what was the purposefulness of that for you? Again, like not trying to say like, why didn't you get angry at me? Like as like now it's your problem again because you're the one who didn't express anger right. But no, like I mean, I can easily imagine the stereotypes and sociocultural pressure that say the fine line that Black people, that Black women have to navigate in order to be heard and understood while not being dismissed as rude, aggressive, like emotional, etc. So, but the client being able to speak to that experience and again bridging other members in this dialogue, not just necessarily just a back and forth between me and them the whole time, as a way to really articulate their subjective painful feelings and the fear of how I would react to it and having that shift. Again, that it's not meant to have a happy ending because I don't think happiness is the goal, but really just by honoring that. And I think for me, trusting in that process has really paid dividends for people. Now, again, this doesn't mean that this is like the goal, right? Like ideally, we're not looking to just be really great at rupture and repairs. Ideally, we want to be aware enough to not, to be mindful and not make those statements or kind of, misgender or kind of do things like that with clients. But we're not perfectionistic. So it is important to have these, to have a way to be able to honor and hold that tenderly as it happens. So yeah, tolerate that emotional reaction to stress, take in the emotions pointed at the therapist, and then reinforce the future frustrations and concerns will be met with understanding, encourage the disavowed affective states. There's some real pride, and it's a gift that you're giving to the group by being able to express that anger. And, people really need to see that, like, it's okay to do that when somebody really sets about, like, crosses a boundary and does something hurtful. And I hurt you, like that. I hurt you with my carelessness and my, those white supremacist poles, like from my past or from the social cultural systems I've been raised in. Again, it's not a huge, like, shameful thing on me, because again, I feel like it's impossible for me to escape that pole. And so when I don't take that personally as like, how could I? I'm a racist, what's wrong with me? And just more like, no, I mean, like, of course, you're going to have those covert and overt influences throughout our whole social cultural context be like attached to you in some ways and pull at you. And that like is, an understandable part of our existence in whatever culture we're in. The same way that we pick up narratives in our families, we pick up narratives in our cultural, social families, right? Empathy, in any case, to move on. Old definition, the capacity to think and feel oneself into the inner life of another person. That was the original definition that Kohat kind of spoke to. He rebelled against the idea of theory taking a stance like for interpreting as opposed to the subjective experience of clients, like we've talked about. And self-psychology, and I'm guilty of this too. Like, I'm going to be honest, I didn't pick it the first time, like, because I read the article and I was like, this is essentially saying, be nice. It's empathy, like, be empathic. I know how to be empathic. I'm great at being empathic. I'm the most empathic person I know. It's not just about like being nice. It's actually like Kohat talks about how empathy can be used again to get inside the inner worlds of many people. And he was raised around like the World War II era. And so he talked about how the Nazi planes had, the bombers had sirens that blasted, which I really didn't actually know that existed, but that was a way that empathy was used pretty villainously, like to instill more fear into the already fearful, like, populace overhead as the bombs were like being dropped. So being nice and kind is not the curative factor of self-psychology either, because it's not just about placating, but really wanting to honor and accept the utility of their adaptations throughout life. That's not just like, yeah, it's okay you feel that way. Yeah, it's a very oversimplified view of it. So analysts, therapists, people, we always tap into our subjective experiences in order to understand our clients' patients' experiences. I like this phrase that I can't remember if I coined or someone else gave it to me, but we are our only frame of reference for the world. Like, this is it. I have no other frame of reference. And every time I say something about somebody else, every time I bridge or I fantasize or I imagine what somebody else is going from, I am pulling from some relational experience to myself, because that's the only tool, it's the only book that I have to reference. Now, this new definition of empathy takes into account that we're not neutral and we can't just be this objective observer inside the inner world of someone. We have our own subjectivity when we're empathizing. And so thinking of it like, again, this dance or this meeting between two subjective worldviews through that clarity and meaning making. So you might say things like, from my frame of reference, as a white male, as somebody who's been hurt before or broken up with someone, I'm imagining that you felt like X, and kind of giving them that frame of reference from your subjectivity and then seeing what resonates with you about that. So is that resonating with you mostly, kind of? Okay, so what part am I missing or leaving out? How can you help me understand what that's like for you or how it's different from my experience? And kind of make it a clear idea that, I'm not wanting you to take anything that I say as I postulate as a fact or a truth. I'm just expressing my curiosity and I want you to correct me. I want to give you permission explicitly to correct me when I obviously only use myself as the frame of reference, and I'm going to miss your experience as a blank identity person who has a very different life experience than me. So yeah, as a white male with ADHD, I feel that being selfish was always followed by shame, and have a hard time asking for help for fear of burdening others and having them reject or leave me. So that's not to say this is your experience, but I wanted to provide you my view and be curious about how we might differ or align with one another. So I hope these are some ways that, again, you can have a sense of how to create those empathic experiences as you lean in closer towards the subjective truth of a client. Resistance and or adaptation. Adaptations, not resistances, may occur in therapy, because when people, become silent or they choose to not disclose in group, rather than thinking about they're resistant, they're not ready, they're not trying. No, that also needs to be honored, and we really need to be curious and maybe again mentalize or help the group members be reflective on why this is necessary for this member to be adapting in this way. What makes it so hard to speak in this? Why could this be that way for them? And again, not with the goal of making them be the most social person by the end, but just being able to have that felt, validated truth is the curative factor, again, in a lot of ways. Goals to acknowledge that foregoing the adaptations earlier in life is akin to asking someone to drop a shield that kept them psychologically, emotionally, and physically alive. And so when you say, just don't be that way or just express your anger at me, and that's something that literally I would be beaten or I would be killed if I did that with my family, then we're really asking a very unfair thing from them. So we had this neat metaphor in one of my groups where they talked about the boxing gloves. I feel like I'm like this. One of my clients had mentioned that. And I said, that's really great, because I think what we sometimes do is we're, have our boxing gloves up, and the idea that people think in therapy is hey, I'm going to take those off of you and remove them, and you can put your hands down. I don't want to do that. I think you needed those gloves. I think you still need those gloves in some ways. You built your life around those gloves protecting you. So let's just have you look and describe your gloves. Who gave you these gloves? What did you need them for? Why was this meaningful for you to have them there? Why is it still meaningful for you to keep them? Because again, I think that imbues more trust and safety, and paradoxically can help people, feel because you're acknowledging that it's okay for me to keep these gloves and have them up as long as I want, whenever I want them, then there's more security and feeling maybe I don't need them as much today. Maybe I can put one down and have one up. Again, that's not the enemy, and we're not getting rid of those. Those are something that maybe we can be flexible with, but they're a tool and a good tool to have. So you really, as a self-psychologist, like in that way, or using self-psychology, I should say, like you don't have to be a psychologist, you serve as an ally. You really acknowledge the utility and necessity of these adaptations. Instead of this combative stance that I feel like modern analytic and other like theoretical stances sometimes take, the therapist is really to have the ability to have the group come and understand the necessity of that. Could we speculate on why it might be necessary and adaptive for Kamel to be dismissive of other people's concerns in the group? Like, and I say that, you know, as a group as a whole question inquiry, if that, you know, feels like I want there to be an open discussion and not target someone. But oftentimes I would bridge like somebody specifically that may share that adaptive style that Kamel has of like pushing away intimacy or like care, love, and have that person be able to mentalize, speak for Kamel, speak for themselves about that resistance, adaptation. You know, or somebody who's on the opposite end of that and maybe like can understand what it's like when they don't dismiss people's like concerns and they just always like they feed off people's concerns. That antithetical resistance can also be, or antithetical like adaptation can be helpful as well, just to bridge closer to that felt experience. And oftentimes whenever somebody gives an interpretation, I'll always ask like, you know, Kamel, like, did that land with you? Is that not quite what your experience is like? Like, how can you help us understand more? You know, again, just trying to like ease closer and closer towards their felt subjective truth, as opposed to just having it be that interpretation's right. The room all agrees that you're doing this because you don't want to be like, you know, cared for because you'll be too selfish or whatever they might say. Kohut believed in the intersubjectivity of experiences, and again, that reflected that our instrument in psychotherapy to comprehend the inner lives of others is our own introspection on our lives and the empathy process, which is you know, very good. Last thing, real quick, intersubjectivity theory. I think this is really cool. Really feels like the interbeing Thich Nhat Hanh piece that I really love yeah, it's impossible to be objective. It's just completely implausible in this. All observations are filtered through a lens of our subjective theoretical preconceptions. We start first with a theory that precedes our observation, and then because of that, it's not possible to be a neutral, objective, unprejudiced observer of external facts. So, you know, this kind of goes with this contextualism, is this philosophical guide. No person, phenomenon, dynamic is in a vacuum. The analyst and the patient, the therapist and the client, they both enter R together. Without one, the other wouldn't exist, right? There is no therapist without clients. There's no client without therapists. And you know, that they influence one another and they're together in each other's presence. There's a lot of really wonderful like articles and books, maybe I'll speak to in different sections, that highlight the power differential. And that power is not an amulet that is just worn by one person and not owned by somebody else, but it's a shared dynamic dance between people. Even in one where there's a completely subjugated class, like a slave master and their slave, like I'm trying to remember the exact person. I don't think it was Lewin, but I'll look up the reference for next time. There's still an important like power, even recognizing that it's not proportional. It's not like a 50-50, obviously. And it's not to validate that, but with the master-slave dynamic, there's still a necessity for the person to depend on that person for their labor, and so they don't hold all the power for it. Now, they manipulate the systems and they control people to keep that power, and it's gonna like so bother me, like as far as what this book was referenced for. There's a really helpful book, and I'll try and like put it maybe in the references for the video as well, that talks about that how, again, people in power tend to want to like maintain that power. And again, if power is safety, like, you know, and comfort, then naturally, like we're gonna want to keep it and hold on to it. So when I think about like the dialogues that we're having on race and white supremacist culture, recognizing that I am this way, I have certain privileges and certain benefits in my life because of the way that other people are, oppressed and marginalized, subjugated, and that. And like holding on to that as a reality of, this system and what it co-creates and what it perpetuates in terms of the mass incarceration and all the other inequities and the systems we navigate is really meaningful, because then to me, like that sends a sense of interconnectedness, that like, there's something that I have a need, like to be able to use this power and privilege to be able to assist, to be able to help deconstruct and reconstruct these systems from a more communicative or sort of justice stance. So all that is to say, I think I, again, got a little distracted, but felt meaningful to speak to that in terms of how contextualism really focuses on our interdependence with one another in those dynamics. And that I think is helpful, just to be able to understand the complexity in the dance that people do with their power differentials and how these things stay sustained and how we can deconstruct them. So the self is cannot be understood apart from its self-object experiences. So you as a person cannot be pulled apart from your experiences from the culture, the family, other parts that you've lived in, and you weren't responsible for those. You didn't choose those. You didn't choose the family, the brain, the culture that you lived in. And so to personalize that as your fault is not realistic to the frame. And if you do blame yourself, then again, recognizing that that's the adaptation that the culture and messages have pulled you to believe at this point, because that's what is necessary to survive in that environment, right? To take responsibility, or else it won't get accepted. Intersubjectivists' task is to interpret and illuminate the patient's unconscious to organized activities so that you can recognize as they become manifest in the dialogue between members. So this is kind of akin to the transactional analysis drivers, in which when we say I'm not okay or I am okay when these things occur. So we all get these binary emotional narratives in our lives that tell us certain themes or emotional narrative threads that get tied to us. I'm unlovable if I'm not accommodating others. People will leave me if they see my selfishness. If I don't take full responsibility for things, I'll never learn. And then they talk about these two last pieces of intersubjective conjunction and intersubjective disjunction. These are things between the client and therapist that can occur. So a conjunction intersubjectively is when you and the client have very similar organized themes and narratives for how the world works, and to be cautious about that, because it can be really easy to just feel affirmed and mirrored and validated in that need that we have, and just say yeah, men are selfish, they're just assholes, all of them. But then recognizing again that may limit the scope of being able to understand and validate, while also holding to that subjectivity of that lens, that it's not an objective truth, just because you both hold that subjective parallel. And then the intersubjective disjunction is when a therapist assimilates the client's life material into themes that change its subjective meaning for the patients. Again, when we get into diagnoses, interpretations, these cognitive analytical stances to say the reason why you don't eat is for a need for control, over your environment. Sometimes clients will resonate with that, but if they don't, then that interpretation isn't helpful. That's maybe a step towards making that connection, or to meeting them where that meaning is for them. But if you continue to have these disjunctions towards people's experiences, which again, I think as a white person, can be easy to, blame or kind of put the onus on lots of other things before we put it on the idea of racism or classism or other kinds of isms that have impacted a subjugated group, then that continuous disavowed or disjunction can be really harmful to the therapeutic rapport. So you don't have to be certain about any of these things, and it doesn't hurt for you to pose something with curiosity and openness towards moving closer to a subjective felt truth. And when you get there, the clients will be affirming and like, that's me. That's representative of my empathic narrative. So hope this was helpful. I really love talking about this theory, and yeah, thank you all for your time.